Moral theology is the scientific exposition of human conduct so far as it is directed by reason and faith to the attainment of our supernatural final end. In contradistinction to moral theology is ethics or moral philosophy, which is based on human reason alone and recognizes only a natural end. Dogmatic theology treats of God, his essence, and activity for the salvation of mankind. Ascetical theology is concerned with the attainment of Christian perfection. Mystical theology deals with the higher forms of contemplation and union with God. Pastoral theology is the science of the cure of souls. Finally, canon law regulates the external, ecclesiastical life of the members of the Church. Division of moral theology. Moral theology is divided into three parts: the doctrine on first principles, on the commandments, and on the sacraments. First principles treat of the general conditions and qualities with which every action must be endowed in order that it may contribute to man's supernatural ultimate end. The doctrine on the commandments has as its object those laws that man must observe to attain his end. The doctrine on the sacraments treats of the divinely instituted means for reaching man's last end.
Man must attain his last end by personal activity in conformity with the remote objective and proximate subjective norms of moral action, namely law and conscience. These norms are violated by sin, their observance is made easy by the virtues. Thus the division of the doctrine on first principles is given. Part 1. Personal activity. Personal actions, by means of which man attains his supernatural end, must be human, morally good, and supernaturally meritorious. Since supernaturally meritorious acts are treated in dogmatic theology, we are not concerned with them here. Chapter 1. Human acts. Human acts, actus humani, are those actions that proceed from knowledge and free will. Human acts are to be distinguished from the acts of man, actus hominis, i.e., those acts of human beings that are not dependent upon knowledge and free will, for example, breathing. Article 1. Principles of human acts. 1. The knowledge must embrace the action itself. The so-called motus primo primi are not human acts and consequently have no moral character, for example, thoughts, imaginations, and tendencies which are elicited by the intellectual or volitional faculties of man before he becomes aware of them, such as an impulse of anger, aversion, and so on. Object of the action with all its proximate circumstances. An action is human and therefore good or bad only in so far as its object is known. If one kills another knowing him to be his father, he is guilty of patricide. If he thinks his victim is a stranger, he is guilty of homicide. If he believes it is an animal which he may lawfully hunt, he commits no sin at all. The possibility of not acting or of acting otherwise. Only when this possibility is recognized can there be free consent of the will, without which neither good nor evil deeds are imputable. 2. The free consent of the will may be a perfectly or an imperfectly voluntary act, according as something is willed with full knowledge and full consent, or only with imperfect knowledge and imperfect consent. Thus an imperfectly voluntary act is one performed in semi-wakefulness, partial intoxication, or during a violent fit of passion. An actually or virtually voluntary act, according as the consent of the will is actually present to the consciousness of the agent, or endures only in its effects without his being conscious thereof. An actually voluntary act is had, for example, when one is conscious of the fact that he is now baptizing. A virtually voluntary act is had if one, having the intention to baptize, goes to the font but in the act of baptizing is so distracted that he no longer realizes what he is doing. The habitually and interpretatively voluntary acts differ from the foregoing. An habitually voluntary act is one that was at one time an actually voluntary act, but, although not revoked, nevertheless does not continue in itself nor in its effect, and therefore does not influence the resultant action, for example, the conferring of a sacrament, but which is nevertheless sufficient that an effect be produced upon one, such as the reception of a sacrament. An interpretatively voluntary act is one that never existed, but which would exist if the person acting had the necessary knowledge. It is insufficient even for the reception of a sacrament. A directly or indirectly voluntary act, voluntarium, in se vel. In causa, according as something is willed in itself, or is not willed in itself, but only permitted because of its inseparable connection with some action or omission. That likewise is willed in itself, which is only willed as a means, for example, the death of the fetus to save the mother. Article 2. Imputability of human acts. The imputability of a human act consists in this: that one may be declared the free author of an action and its consequences, and may be held responsible for the same. Since we must positively will the good and avoid the evil, imputability differs according as there is question of a directly or an indirectly voluntary act. The directly voluntary act voluntarium in se is always imputed to the agent as either good or bad. An indirectly voluntary act voluntarium in causa is never ascribed to the agent if it concerns a good effect, but in many cases it is imputed to him if the effect is bad. The imputability of a bad effect requires a will in the make them like lao in tiffing about follow. If the foregoing conditions required for the imputability of an evil effect are verified, the sin is committed at the moment when the cause is posited. One is guilty of sin even if the cause accidentally fails to produce its effect. Undertaking an act that has an evil effect is lawful only if the following four conditions are simultaneously verified. That the action itself must be good or at least morally indifferent. B. A good effect must follow from the action at least as immediately as the evil effect. Hence this rule is sometimes referred to as the principle of double effect. Should the good effect only follow by means of the evil effect, then evidently this latter must first be willed as an evil means, which cannot be justified by a good end. Therefore, an unmarried mother may not procure abortion to avoid disgrace. On the other hand, it is lawful for a pregnant woman to take medicine which is necessary for her health, even though this medicine should cause an abortion. Likewise, one may attend a sick person even though this may cause one sexual temptations. The intention must be directed to the good effect exclusively. If therefore the good effect can be obtained by means that have no evil effect, such means must be preferred. Herein there must be a sufficient reason to permit the evil effect. The reason must be in proportion to the malice of the evil effect, to the certainty of its following, to the immediacy with which it will follow, and to the gravity of the agent's personal obligation, for example piety, contract to avoid the evil effect, and also to the probability that the evil effect would not follow if the action were omitted, for example. If the only saloon keeper in town refuses to give a toper drink, the latter will not become intoxicated. Article 3. Obstacles to human acts. An obstacle to human activity is anything that impairs either knowledge or free will. In proportion to the hindrance, imputability may be diminished or it may be wanting altogether. 1. Ignorance. Concept. By ignorance is here meant the lack of necessary knowledge. What is said of ignorance holds also for error, which is a false judgment about something, and for inadvertence, which is had when one knows a thing quite well, but for the moment does not think of it. False notions about religious or moral matters as well as prejudices do not in themselves differ from error. Division. Ignorance may be divided into a. Ignorance of law or of fact. Juris vel facti, according as the law itself or some fact is not known. B. Ignorance that is antecedent, consequent, or concomitant. Ignorance is antecedent if it is not willed and if it precedes the free consent of the will. It matters not whether the ignorance exercises an influence on an action, so that the action would not have taken place if the necessary knowledge had been present antecedent in the strict sense, or whether it has no such influence on the action so that the action would have taken place even if there had been no such ignorance. Concomitant ignorance. Consequent ignorance is willed either directly or indirectly, proceeding thus from the free will. See ignorance that is vincible or invincible. Ignorance is called vincible if it can be dispelled by moral diligence in keeping with the proximate circumstances of the person and object. If the use of such means is insufficient to remove the ignorance, it is called invincible. According to the greater or lesser degree of negligence of which one is guilty, vincible ignorance may be simply vincible, crass, or supine. If one deliberately wills to remain ignorant, his vincible ignorance is affected. Influence of ignorance on the will and consequently on moral imputability. A. Invincible ignorance destroys the voluntariness of an act and also its sinfulness. If one eats meat on Friday, being firmly convinced that it is Thursday, he does not sin. Hence anxiety regarding actions one did years ago, not knowing their sinful character, is unreasonable. Vincible ignorance, except it be affected, diminishes the voluntariness of an act and its sinfulness. Unless one's blameworthy negligence is insignificant, his vincible ignorance does not diminish liberty to the extent that a gravely sinful action becomes only venially sinful. The gravity of the sin is determined by the degree of culpable negligence, not by the effects that follow such negligence. The worse these effects are foreseen to be, the greater must be the effort made to avoid them.
Violence is force brought to bear upon one against his will by some extrinsic agent. When absolute violence is used, the will resists as best it can. Relative violence is that which can be overcome by greater opposition, but the extra effort is either not made, or sufficient resistance is offered only externally, while internal consent is being given. Influence on imputability. A. Absolute violence destroys free will. Therefore, whatever is done under its influence is not imputable. External resistance is necessary if the force can be repelled, or if scandal or the danger of consent should result from non-resistance. If one is certain he will not consent, he may omit external resistance if this is very difficult or dangerous. Relative violence diminishes free will and consequently imputability. 3. Fear. Concept. Fear is mental anxiety because of an impending evil. We are here considering the influence which an evil exercises on the mind. Apart from this, an evil often greatly influences the sensitive faculty. The evil may threaten him who fears, or his relatives, friends, and so on. Division. Fear may be a grave or slight, according as one is threatened by a grave evil which one cannot easily escape, or only by a slight one, or even by a great evil which one can easily avoid. Fear is absolutely or relatively grave according as it exercises a great influence upon the average person or only upon a particular person, for example because of his timidity. Reverential fear consists in this, that a subject fears to oppose someone to whom he is obliged to show reverence. If by this kind of fear one understands the dislike one experiences in offending some respectable person, it is only a slight fear. If, because of such opposition, one must expect vexation, perpetual disfavor, and so on, reverential fear may also be grave. B. Extrinsic or intrinsic, according as its cause is external or internal. Fear of death because of the imminent danger of shipwreck is extrinsic. Fear of death from a disease is intrinsic. If extrinsic fear is caused by some free agent, it will be just or unjust according as the person causing it is justified in so doing or not. Influence of fear on imputability. Fear does not destroy the voluntary character of our actions, but it usually lessens their guilt as also their merit. They are simply voluntary, but also involuntary in a certain regard. Fear makes one will what otherwise he would not will. If, under the influence of fear, one consents to a good or bad act with resistance, its merits or guilt are thereby lessened. It is to be noted, however, that the obligation of the positive law sometimes ceases on account of great inconvenience. Similarly, laws often invalidate actions that have been posited through great fear, or they make such actions rescindable at the instance of him who was influenced by fear. Fear which influences the sensitive appetite may, by this very fact, affect imputability in the same manner as does passion.
IV. Concupiscence.
Concept. Concupiscence or passion is a movement of the sensitive appetite which is produced by good or evil as apprehended by the imagination. Division. Concupiscence is an antecedent when it precedes the action of the will and induces the will to consent. This takes place, for example, in involuntary movements of hatred, anger, and of the sexual appetite. Concupiscent if it follows the free determination of the will and is either freely consented to or deliberately aroused. Concupiscence is deliberately aroused if one consciously fosters motions that arise of their own accord, or if one purposely stimulates his passions, for example, by reading immoral literature or by reflecting upon injuries received. Influence on imputability. An antecedent concupiscence always lessens imputability and at times even destroys it entirely, according as one is hindered in the use of his reason or completely deprived thereof by passion. A grave sin may nevertheless be committed even though imputability is lessened. Moreover, the passion is generally willed indirectly, either because one exposes himself to danger without adequate reason, or because he does not resist his passionate disposition in spite of a clear knowledge of his obligation in that regard. Practically, it is often difficult to determine whether the diminution of imputability is sufficient to excuse one from grave sin or not. In such cases, one must leave the judgment to God. Consequent passion never lessens imputability, but generally increases it. The increase of imputability is due to the fact that the sensitive movement is purposely intensified by consequent concupiscence, so that the good or evil is willed more intensely. V. Habit is a facility and a readiness of acting in a certain manner acquired by repeated acts. Some habits affect an organic change in the human organism, habits of drink, impurity, and so on. Others have no such effect. Division. Habits are natural or moral. Natural habits are those contracted without advertence to their effects in the moral sphere, or at least they persist against the will. Moral habits are those that are either freely contracted or consciously maintained. Influence on imputability. A. Whoever strives earnestly to rid himself of a bad habit does not sin in doing the evil deed by force of habit without advertence to its sinful character. V. Whoever does not strive earnestly to break himself of a bad habit, although he adverts to his obligation of so doing, sins every time he adverts to this. He does not sin, however, at the moment he acts by force of a neglected habit, if he does so without adverting to the sinful character of his action. Such a sin is indirectly willed, i.e. voluntary in cause. Nervous mental diseases are disorders of the brain and nervous system, involving a sympathetic influence on the mind and will. Functional diseases are such as manifest themselves by disturbances in the operation of the organs, without apparent pathological change in the organs themselves. Organic nervous diseases are those in which some pathological affection of the nerve substance itself is noticeable, for instance in softening of the brain. Specific mental disturbances. A neurasthenia is a permanent condition of abnormal irritability of the nervous system associated with a tendency to premature exhaustion. Neurasthenics are affected by external stimuli and by internal exhaustion much more intensely than the objective state of things would warrant. Hence they imagine themselves to be afflicted with various kinds of illnesses, although in reality they are bodily sound. Furthermore, their depressed disposition brings on a disturbance in the activity of their will, influenced by a feeling of dissatisfaction. The will loses the power to come to a decision abulia, or to carry out its decision energia. Hysteria consists in a pathological irritability by virtue of which psychic experiences can, in a blindly impulsive way, react with abnormal intensity on exterior behavior and on various forms of physical expression. Hysterics either react with abnormal vehemence, or they do not react at all, or at most only mildly, even to the strongest stimuli. Combined with this condition we also find anomalies of the emotional life. Most striking in hysterics is their affective irritability. Uncontrolled outbursts of anger are followed by happy abandon and exuberance of spirit. Egotism is strongly developed in them, likewise a mania for attracting attention and self-assertiveness. Combined with all this there is a strong propensity to lying and stealing, and to moral dissipation. Extreme caution must always be exercised by the priest in his relations with hysterics. Compulsion phenomena are psychic factors which do not admit of normal repression by volitional influences, so that a man may be compelled to think or to act in a certain way. There are compulsive memory images, compulsive feelings, compulsive observations, compulsive fears, compulsive doubts, compulsive actions, and so forth. Under this heading we must also group the various manias, for example, kleptomania, also all irresistible urges. Hypochondria is a pathological state arising from depressive common human feelings and organic sensations, combined with exaggerated anxiety concerning the meaning of these phenomena. Hypochondriacs imagine themselves the victims of every possible disease. They examine their feces for tapeworms, their phlegm for tuberculosis, urinary sediment they take to be kidney stones, their taste buds, cancerous growths. Every harmless skin affection is syphilis, an oppressive feeling in the head is an indication of softening of the brain, and so on. In the more degenerate forms of hypochondria, the patient makes even more fantastic discoveries. There is a frog in his stomach, he has no bowels or no brains, etc. All this gives rise to a state of anxiety. The patient becomes alarmed, he suffers convulsions and develops a propensity to suicide. Melancholia is a permanent state of despondency, growing out of the fact that the emotional tone attending all perception assumes a depressive character at the slightest stimulation, while with normal people it becomes so only when the stimulation has reached a certain high degree of intensity. Morbid melancholia must not be confused with the melancholy temperament. Such patients are incapable of joy, for every fresh impression brings on a pang of sadness. Even words of solace, and especially any attempt to cheer them up, are but as wormwood to their spirit. Add to this that the process of mental presentation is slowed down and becomes impeded. The associative mental power breaks down, memory fails to function properly. The will encounters resistance from numerous quarters and finds it hard to make decisions, and even harder to put them into execution. Sometimes there are neither feelings of pleasure nor pain. Complete lack of all mental sensibility manifests itself. Such patients complain of inner desolation, of inability to love those of their own family circle, of incapacity for prayer or contrition. Their inhibitions can become so great that all bodily activity ceases. But it may also happen that the feelings of fear and anxiety attendant upon melancholia may impel patients to wander about restlessly, to bite at their nails, to tear at their hair, to sigh and moan and groan, to scream to the point of frenzy. Then they begin to labor under delusions, for instance that they are leading a wicked impious life, or that they have led such a life. Often they become hypochondriacs. They may also be haunted by hallucinations and illusions. They see the devil, they hear threatening voices, and so on. They are very prone to suicide. They look upon death either as a liberation from fear and anxiety or as an expiation for sin. These sudden impulsive ideas assert themselves in their minds so forcibly as to displace all contrary ideas. Usually they are able to conceal their thoughts of suicide. The more advanced melancholics, moreover, are pronounced mental cases. Psychopathic inferiority is a permanent state of intellectual and moral infirmity. Though the intelligence rating of some few psychopaths may be surprisingly high, still there will always be some element of eccentricity about them, but generally their intelligence is decidedly inferior. In their criminal acts, such individuals neglect even the most ordinary considerations of prudence and allow others to use them for the most dangerous undertakings. Besides, their affections cloud their judgment. Punishments they deem spite-work juridical decisions are the result of prejudice. For this reason it is so difficult to educate these psychopaths. And since they lack the power of prolonged concentration, their recollections become indistinct and their memory fails them. Should, however, their fancy be vividly aroused and autosuggestion ensue, memory illusions will develop, to which they cling tenaciously. Quite often, too, they are guilty of intentional lying. The will lacks strength and stability. Decisions are made on the spur of the moment. The emotional life suffers even greater disturbance. The affective life may be highly tensioned, manifested, for example, by a very irascible temperament. But they may also evince a blunted affective life, combined with great apathy and absolute inactivity. Crass egotism may be found side by side with tenderness of feeling, scrupulosity with laxity, coarseness with sentimentality, and so on. Most psychopathic patients tend towards moral degeneracy. They do indeed have a knowledge of good and evil, but they lack moral sentiments. They scarcely ever experience the emotions of sympathy, of gratitude, of love, of contrition, of courtesy, of propriety. They lack all susceptibility for praise or blame. Their interests are all selfish and limited to sense enjoyment. Hence they show no consideration whatever for their environment or their family. They are devoid of shame and altogether unrestrained and careless. Imputability is destroyed to the extent that certain ideas and fancies so take possession of their mind that it cannot at all, or only with great difficulty, give attention to other considerations. Consequently, freedom of choice is either altogether impeded or at least greatly diminished. The reason why certain ideas take complete possession of their mind in this way may lie in this, that they are so overpowering as to dislodge all other ideas from consciousness altogether, or almost so. Or it may be that other ideas do not emerge into consciousness, or do so only in a passing, fleeting way. The feeble-minded person, for instance, who sets fire to a barn, will often think only of the delight that the fire will afford him, but not of the damage or the sinfulness connected with his act. The morbidly melancholy person often is aware only of his evil forebodings, and suicide seems to him to be the only way out. Ethical objections do not even present themselves for the moment. Ethical considerations do come to the mind of the unstable, morbidly fickle character at the time of temptation, but often they are brushed aside by other ideas before they can exercise their influence. In a man devoid of feeling, a brutal act will scarcely arouse any reaction at all, hence he does not adjudge such acts so bad as they really are. In the self-assertive and fantastic psychopath, anything that subserves the glorification of self or the realization of his own ideas becomes his sole interest, crowding out all other considerations. In the morbidly irritable person, the affections, for example anger or fear, may become so intense that only the idea corresponding to the affection may be present in his mind, and this he proceeds to execute without any further deliberation. The abulic psychopath often does not come to a decision abulia, or to the execution of a decision energia, because the respective obligation does not sufficiently impress itself upon his consciousness. The reason for this is either that for want of energy the obligation to decide or to act is only dimly emphasized by the emotions, or that feelings of aversion toward doing so have taken complete possession of consciousness. In the individual case it will be very difficult to determine to what extent freedom of choice and hence responsibility are nullified. In most instances this must be left to the judgment of God. The confessor should be very mild in his judgment of these psychopathic penitents. As a rule, however, it will not be in place to assure them outright that under the given circumstances they no longer sin, for in a specific case this could hardly be determined. Moreover, there is also the danger that the penitent might give up all efforts at restraining his evil inclinations. If these penitents have been guilty of an objectively grave sinful action, they should ordinarily not be allowed to receive Holy Communion without previous confession. But because a doubt as to the gravity of their sin will usually persist, the confessor may in certain cases more readily presume that opportunity for confession was not present because of a dearth of confessors. Diseased penitents may, even when clear insight is present, be excused from positive obligations, especially those arising out of the commandments of the Church. Compulsion ideas, however blasphemous thoughts, for instance, and compulsion effects arise entirely independently of the will and persist against the will, and are therefore not sinful. This must absolutely be made clear to the penitents if they are accustomed to consider the very presence of such thoughts sinful, even though they indignantly repulse them. Often, too, such penitents will confess that they consented to impure feelings, mistaking the natural pleasurable sensations for consent. It may sometimes be more difficult to diagnose compulsion when there is question of matters in which even normal people have inordinate inclinations. In such cases there may be danger of self-deception. However, it is possible that for the moment violent impulses may, with or without previous struggle, overwhelm all rational reflection and impel to blind action. Thus the act is performed without, or at least almost without deliberation, and hence there is no sin at all, or at most a venial sin. Actions which are performed with a clear realization that one could also, and indeed should, act otherwise, will be grievously or venially sinful according to the concrete circumstances. Compulsory representations may be aggravated by the very fact that an attitude of anxiety and fear is developed towards them, and that desperate efforts are made to avoid them, for in this wise the attention is concentrated upon them. In such cases, the patients do best to disregard such phenomena altogether. Then, too, since examination of conscience and confession but serve to draw detailed attention anew to such thoughts, thus aggravating the temptation, these patients are often excused from making a detailed examination of conscience and a complete confession. It would be best for these patients always to return to the same confessor. If they have agreed to do that, the confessor may allow the first confession to be a detailed manifestation of their whole case. In subsequent confessions, however, he should allow only general accusations, as for instance, I accuse myself of my sins against faith, against holy purity, and so on, in the manner in which I first confessed them to you. If doubt and fear become very intensified, it is only right that these patients be told that in their condition they can hardly commit a mortal sin, although they must of course resist their evil inclinations. If the act corresponding to the compulsion is not evil in itself, but constitutes only an occasion of sin, and so forth, the compulsion may often be got rid of by performing the act to which the person is impelled. For the purpose of effecting a cure, it is perfectly permissible for a patient to expose himself to such an occasion. But since the end does not justify the means, one cannot, even in the interests of a cure, allow these patients to perform actions which are evil in themselves, and this applies also to those patients who, because of their diseased condition, are no longer fully responsible for their actions. At times a scrupulous conscience is associated with compulsory representation. Chapter 2. Moral Acts. A moral act is an act done freely and with advertence to its relation to the norm of morality. The ultimate norm of morality is the eternal law of God, determining the essence, acts, and ends of all things according to their moral values. The proximate norm of morality is the human mind in so far as it recognizes the eternal law and applies it in individual instances, that is, conscience. An act is morally good or morally bad according as it agrees or disagrees with the norm of morality. It is controverted whether there can be morally indifferent acts in the concrete. The principles of morality, or the determinants of the moral act, are all those elements of human conduct that have a bearing upon the norm of morality, namely, the object, the circumstances, and the end. That an action be morally good, none of these elements may conflict with the norm of morality. The object is the thing with which an action is essentially concerned, for example, taking another's goods in an act of stealing. The object of an action may be good, bad, or indifferent. The circumstances are those proximate conditions that help to determine the moral nature of a human act. They stand in relation to it as accidents to the substance. Circumstances may concern the object, the agent, or the action itself, for example, the theft of a sacred object, ill treatment of one mother, or a long-standing enmity. Circumstances may make a good action bad, a venial sin mortal, or vice versa. They may also add a new goodness or badness to an action. An external act probably takes its entire moral value from the interior disposition and therefore in itself has no influence on the goodness or badness of the action, but accidentally it generally does influence the moral value of an action, since by it the inner act is often repeated, is of longer duration, and gains added intensity, and also because the external act may serve either to edify or to scandalize others. The end or motive is the reason for which the agent undertakes an act. If the motive is morally sinful, the whole action is bad, no matter whether the end is unique or whether other aims are associated with it. If the end is venially sinful, the whole action is venially sinful if the agent has no other end in view. If, however, besides the bad end, good ends are also intended, the action is partly good and partly venially sinful. For example, if one gives alms partly out of charity and partly because of vanity. A good motive imparts additional moral goodness to a good act, but it never takes away the badness from an evil act, therefore, the end does not justify the means. Part 2. The Law. The supreme objective norm of morality is the eternal law, that is, God's divine plan by which all created things are directed from all eternity to one supreme end and aim. God has in time made known his divine will through the natural moral law, and the positive divine law, and he also makes known his will mediately through human laws which may be enacted by the Church or by the state. Chapter 1. Law and cognate concepts. Customs, precepts, and privileges have many things in common with law. A law is a permanent rational norm for free activity, enacted and adequately promulgated by the superior of a public community for the sake of the common welfare. The common welfare demands that a law be just, morally good, possible of observance, and necessary for, or at least conducive to, the common good. A law that falls short of these qualifications does not serve the common welfare and therefore has no binding force. Promulgation is necessary in order that a law may actually oblige its subjects. Laws of the Holy See are usually promulgated in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis. Their obligation begins 3 months after the publishing date of the issue in which they appear, unless the nature of the matter demands immediate observance or unless it is expressly stated otherwise in the law. Bishops determine the manner of promulgating episcopal laws which, unless otherwise specified, oblige from the moment of their promulgation. Custom or legalized usage is a right which has been introduced, with consent of the competent authority, by the majority of the members of a public community through their frequent, public, fully deliberate, and continued manner of acting. While that which is enacted by a law is determined by the lawgiver, the object of a custom is specified by the subjects. The binding force of both law and custom derives from the competent authority. Customs are divided into customs in accordance with the law extra legem, contrary to the law contra legem, and in addition to the law praeter legem, according as they interpret a law, abrogate a law, or create a new law. A new obligation is introduced by custom if a majority of the members of a community frequently posit certain acts with the intention of obliging themselves and if they continue to do so for 40 uninterrupted years, provided the custom is reasonable. Laws are interpreted by customs that are in accordance with the law. A precept is a command or a binding manifestation of the will of a superior, issued either in virtue of private authority, father, employer, and so on, or of public jurisdiction, pope, bishop, governor, and so on. That a precept issued in the latter instance be not a law, it is required that the command be imposed either upon individual persons only, or upon the public community merely as a temporary injunction. Precepts imposed upon individuals cease upon the death or cessation from office of him who issued them, unless they were imposed before 2 witnesses or by means of some authentic document. Privileges will be treated separately because of the extensive consideration they require. Chapter 2. Legislator and Subject. The Legislator. God is the supreme lawgiver. The natural and the positive divine law have God as their author. Human legislators both in the Church and in the state derive their authority from God. The Holy Father is the ecclesiastical legislator for the entire Church, as also is a general council in union with him. Plenary and provincial councils can legislate for their districts, as can also diocesan bishops and in like manner vicars and prefects apostolic, abbots and prelates nullius for their territories. For the members of an exempt religious institute, the general chapter at least can make laws. According to the form of government, the civil legislator may be either the ruler alone, or the ruler in conjunction with the representatives, or the representatives in conjunction with the president, or simply the representative body, such as Congress. If a usurper has seized power, his decrees oblige in conscience when the previous legal form of government can no longer be restored, or if it is certain that the usurping regime will be permanently established. Apart from either of these contingencies, there is an obligation in conscience to observe the laws of the usurper only insofar as obedience is necessary for the maintenance of order or for the avoidance of scandal. Subjects of law. The natural law obliges all men. Whoever has not the use of reason does not sin formally by transgressing the moral law, because of ignorance, but another sins who induces him to do so. The same holds for an unlettered person who has the use of reason but is ignorant of the precepts of right reason, or of conclusions flowing from the first principles. This seldom occurs in regard to the primary or general conclusions, but more often in the case of secondary precepts of the natural law. The positive divine law of the New Testament obliges all men first of all to receive baptism, and thereby to become members of the Church. Having been made a Christian through baptism, a person is then obliged to observe the other positive laws of the New Testament, but only those that pertain to the reception of the sacraments. The ceremonial and judicial laws of the Mosaic Code have been abrogated. Its moral enactments that are in harmony with the natural law continue and oblige in virtue of the natural law. Ecclesiastical law obliges all baptized persons who have attained the use of reason and are 7 years of age, and also children under 7 years of age when the Church explicitly so rules. Therefore, even the excommunicated, as well as heretics and schismatics, are obliged by the laws of the Church generally. However, they do not sin by transgressing them because of inculpable ignorance. Some divines believe the Church does not intend to impose upon heretics who are in good faith those of her laws that are primarily ordained for personal sanctification, for example the observance of holy days and days of fasting and abstinence, but that it is always forbidden to induce them to transgress such laws. Other laws, such as matrimonial impediments enacted for the common good of the Church, oblige heretics unless they are exempt by special provision. Children who have the use of reason but have not completed their 7th year are bound by ecclesiastical law only when this is expressly stated, as in the canons concerning Easter Communion and annual confession. Whoever is habitually deprived of the use of reason, the insane, is not bound by the laws of the Church. He is bound, however, if the loss of reason is only temporary. Therefore, one may not serve an intoxicated person meat on Friday. General laws oblige those for whom they are made wherever they may be. If a Catholic is dispensed from a general law of the Church in his home diocese, for example from fasting or from the observance of a holy day, he must observe that law when sojourning in or passing through a strange diocese where the law is in force. On the other hand, when away from home he may use an indult dispensing from a law in the strange diocese, even though such an indult does not obtain in his home diocese. The same holds for transients or those who have no place of residence. Whoever has observed a general law, for example fast and abstinence on December 7th, in one place need not observe it again if he passes to another locality where the law obliges at a later date, because of the transference of the feast. Particular laws oblige only those who have a domicile or quasi-domicile within the respective territory, and only when they actually reside there. When such a resident is absent from his own territory, he is nevertheless obliged by the law of his home diocese if its transgression proves harmful in his own territory, or if there is a question of a personal law. He must likewise observe the particular laws of the territory where he is visiting, if the laws concern the public order or require certain formalities for legal transactions. Transients, or those without a fixed residence, are obliged by the particular laws of the territory where they happen to be. Civil laws oblige the subjects of the respective states. For the sake of the common welfare, aliens residing in the country are held to the observance of laws that concern property, contracts, and crimes. They must likewise observe police regulations. Citizens absent from their country are subject to the laws of their fatherland in things that pertain to their status as citizens, to their office, possessions, and duties back home, but not in things concerning public peace or legal formalities. Chapter 3. Interpretation, Obligation, and Observance of the Law. Interpretation of the law. The interpretation or explanation of a law may be authentic, doctrinal, or customary. The authentic interpretation of a law is given by the legislator, by his successor, or by someone authorized to do so. Should such an interpretation be given in the form of a law, it has the binding force of a law. If it merely explains certain terms of the law that are already obvious in themselves, it need not be promulgated and has retroactive application. If it clarifies a law that is in itself doubtful, or extends or restricts the meaning of the words, it must be promulgated and is not retrospective. If it is given in the form of a judicial sentence or a rescript for an individual case, it has no legal force, and obliges only those persons or affects only those things for which it is given. The doctrinal interpretation of a law is given by jurists.
In the first place, it takes regard to the proper meaning of terms in their context. If the meaning is doubtful or obscure, it has recourse to parallel legislation and takes into consideration the purpose and circumstances of the law and the intention of the legislator. A fundamental rule of jurisprudence is to put as broad as possible an interpretation on the words of a favorable law, and to interpret unfavorable laws strictly, especially penal laws. The customary interpretation of a law is next to the authentic, the best interpretation. Since it obtains the force of a law by custom, it is therefore to be preferred to any merely grammatical or philological explanation of the law. The interpretation of a law in accordance with the mind of the legislator, called ebakeia or equity, is the reasonable taking for granted that the lawgiver would not wish to oblige in some particularly difficult case, even though the case is obviously covered by the wording of the law. Equity avoids the scylla of legalism, which cannot see beyond the letter of the law, and the charybdis of anarchism, which repudiates all law by overriding the rigor of the law. It judges according to the spirit of the law. Ebakeia may not be used if one can readily approach the lawgiver for information, nor can it be applied to laws that void acts, invalidating laws, or to laws that render persons incapable of undertaking certain legal actions, incapacitating laws, since the common welfare requires that certainty be had about the validity of such acts. There is no question of ebakeia or equity in those cases where the lawgiver absolutely could not oblige because, for example, special circumstances make the observance sinful or impossible.
Obligation of the law. All laws oblige in conscience, but not all oblige in the same manner. This obtains even if the legislator is an atheist and does not believe in a conscience. Moral laws impose an obligation in conscience to perform or to omit a certain action. Purely penal laws impose an obligation in conscience to accept the penalties incurred for their violation, but not to omit or perform the actions prescribed by the laws. Wherefore purely penal laws, in so far as the performance or omission of an action goes, have no supernatural sanction, such as the punishment of hell for a grave transgression. In many cases, however, one cannot prescind from the supernatural sanction. In other cases, according to many authors, it is left to the discretion of the lawgiver to determine whether or not his enactments are purely penal. Some ecclesiastical laws and the statutes of many religious institutes are purely penal in character. Whether state laws are penal or not depends, so far as the common welfare does not require a supernatural sanction, on the free will of the civil legislator, and on whether or not he follows modern trends in regard to supernatural sanctions in his legislative philosophy. Even though one does not sin by transgressing a purely penal law, it might readily happen that disobedience will offend against some virtue, for example charity or veracity. Invalidating and incapacitating laws often oblige in conscience, namely when they declare certain legal actions invalid which by nature are valid, or declare certain persons incapable of positing certain actions who are really capable of doing so. Sometimes, however, they do not forbid the contrary act, but only declare it void either when posited or only after a judicial sentence. Such an action must be held void in conscience. Frequently such laws merely bar legal assistance in the prosecution of some claim. Laws based on the presumption of a common danger always oblige, even though in particular cases the danger is absent, for example the law regarding the reading of forbidden books. Laws based on the presumption of a definite fact do not oblige in conscience if the fact is falsely presumed. Thus, if one is sentenced to make restitution for causing unjust damage, he is not bound to observe the sentence if it is certain he had no part in causing the damage. If compelled to do so, he is justified in resorting to secret compensation. Laws always oblige under venial sin in unimportant matters. In grave matters they oblige under mortal sin, unless the lawgiver wills that they bind only under venial sin. Since one must observe the law, he also has the duty to acquire a knowledge of the law. For example, a cleric must read the official diocesan publication to learn the ordinances of his bishop, to use the ordinary means which are absolutely necessary for the observance of the law. For example, a priest must have a breviary and take it with him on a journey, to remove or anticipate obstacles which make the law proximately impossible of observance, and to avoid the danger of transgression. The greater and more proximate the danger and the weightier the law, the greater is the duty of avoiding the danger. The observance of the law. Negative or prohibiting laws are observed by the mere fact that one forbears doing the thing prescribed. Whoever has the intention of not omitting the forbidden act, sins already in thought. Affirmative laws, those that prescribe an action, are observed according to the following distinction. Laws that require a certain matter to be done are satisfied if the thing required is done. Whoever is obliged to pay a debt or a tax is freed from his obligation as soon as he pays the required amount, even though at the time of payment he is completely irresponsible and does not know what he is doing. The obligation is fulfilled also when, for example in a forced sale, one debt is paid against his will. A debt may also be paid by someone other than the debtor, if one may presume this to be agreeable to the debtor. Laws that call for a personal service require that he who is obliged by the law must observe it with knowledge and free will. One cannot therefore fulfill his Sunday obligation by proxy, nor is the obligation satisfied if one is asleep throughout the entire Mass. As to the intention to satisfy one obligation, if the obligation exists independently of the will of the subject, the law will be observed even if in doing the thing prescribed the subject of the law has the intention of not yet observing the law. Whoever communicates during the Easter time or hears Mass on Sunday, not knowing that it is the Paschal season or that it is Sunday, or even if knowing this, intends to fulfill these obligations only later, has nevertheless observed the law and satisfied his obligation, provided that he has at least the intention to pray and to hear Mass. If the obligation is derived from the subject intention to bind himself, even then the intention to satisfy the obligation is not required, but should one at the time he performs the obligatory act have the intention of not satisfying his obligation, the obligation would not be satisfied. If one vows to say the rosary, he fulfills his vow as soon as he says the rosary, even though he does not think of his vow when saying it. But if in saying the rosary he deliberately did not want to fulfill his vow, the vow would thereby not be fulfilled. The intention of fulfilling the purpose of the law is not necessary, therefore. If one feasts on the most delicate fish on Friday, he observes the law of abstinence, although he practices no mortification, which is the purpose of the law. And a stingy man observes the law of fasting, even though he fasts because he is too miserly to buy food. The state of grace is not required unless it belongs to the substance of the work prescribed. Therefore, one does not observe the precept of the Church to confess and communicate annually if he does so sacrilegiously, but he does satisfy his obligation of praying the breviary or of saying his penance even if he does so in mortal sin. Several obligations can be fulfilled by one and the same act, unless this be forbidden by him who imposes the obligation. Should a holy day of obligation fall on Sunday, one double obligation is satisfied by attending one Mass, and viaticum received during the Paschal season satisfies one Easter duty. Though if attendance at Mass is imposed as a penance and confession, the Sunday Mass generally does not suffice, unless the priest declares otherwise. The time for the fulfillment of a law. Several laws may be observed at the same time, provided the different actions simultaneously undertaken are not mutually exclusive and the one imposing the obligation has not forbidden it. Therefore, one may say his breviary, or the penance received in confession during the Sunday Mass. And whether one may go to confession and hear an obligatory Mass at the same time depends on whether or not the confession is of such a nature that it will permit sufficient attention to the Mass. Generally speaking, one cannot observe a law before the legal time for its fulfillment. Sunday obligation is not satisfied by attending Mass on Saturday, nor is the Easter duty satisfied by receiving the sacraments before the Paschal time, and one may not pay his penance before going to confession. If the time designated for the observance of the law has commenced and one foresees he will later be hindered from observing it, he must do so in advance. If one foresees the impossibility of communicating after Easter, he must comply with his Easter duty on or before the feast, and if one cannot attend a late Mass on Sunday, he must assist at an earlier one. If the legal time has elapsed before one has complied with the law, his duty ceases if the lawgiver intended that with the passing of time the obligation also cease. Tempus ad finiendum obliganum, he would still have to observe the law if the time limit was assigned only to urge the fulfillment of the obligation, tempus ad urgendum obliganum. He who misses Mass on Sunday, eats meat on Friday, or omits his breviary sins, but need not make up these omissions. But if one does not communicate during the Easter time, he not only sins but is still bound to make his Easter. Chapter 4. Cessation of Obligation. Although the law continues in force, its obligation ceases to bind in case of ignorance, impossibility, dispensation, or privilege. Besides, the obligation ceases if one leaves the territory where the laws obtain, laws being territorial, since this latter point presents no difficulty it calls for, no further treatment. Ignorance, if invincible, excuses from formal sin even though there is a material violation of the law. Ignorance also excuses from the penalty, but not from the effects of voiding or incapacitating laws. Vincible ignorance does not excuse from sin and often not from the penalty. Impossibility. Physical impossibility excuses from the observance of any and every law. Moral impossibility. Negative or prohibiting natural laws never cease to oblige in case of moral impossibility. Such laws forbid actions that are intrinsically evil, and therefore idolatry, blasphemy, onanism, perjury, and the like are not allowed even to save one life. All other laws cease to oblige when it is morally impossible to observe them. This includes the affirmative natural laws, some divine positive laws, and all human laws. Therefore, one is not obliged to give his life to save the life of his neighbor, to make an integral confession at great risk of health, nor to fast in spite of hard work. The more important a law is, the greater is the inconvenience required to excuse one from it. Divine laws oblige more strictly than human laws, and prohibiting laws are stricter than affirmative laws. Exceptions or cases where laws do oblige at great inconvenience are the following. If the transgression is in contempt of God, religion, or the Church, if the common good is at stake, if a freely chosen position imposes certain heroic sacrifices, or if another person would otherwise be placed in extreme spiritual need. Partial impossibility excuses totally from the observance of the law. If the obligation is indivisible, an obligation is divisible if that part of it which one can observe is sufficient to attain the end of the law. Thus, if one vows to make a pilgrimage but finds he cannot reach the shrine, he need not even begin the pilgrimage, whereas he who cannot recite the entire divine office must recite whatever part of it he can. If one is certain that he cannot observe the whole law and doubts whether he can observe it partially, he is, as a rule, not obliged to anything, since he would otherwise be plagued unceasingly by doubts. In a conflict of obligations, the higher one takes precedence. Duties conflict. When two laws apparently oblige simultaneously, and only one can be observed as a matter of fact, only the more important one actually obliges. Thus the natural law takes precedence over the positive law. Among the laws of nature, a law that prohibits precedes a law that commands. Divine positive law takes precedence over human legislation. The law of a superior society must be preferred to the law of a society which is subordinate to it in purpose and function. Therefore, for example, whoever must care for a dangerously ill person and cannot at the same time attend Sunday Mass is not obliged to hear Mass. If two duties conflict and one cannot in any way determine which of the two is the more important, he does not sin no matter which obligation he fulfills. Dispensation. A dispensation is a relaxation of the obligation of a law in a special case granted by competent authority. Dispensation differs from a privilege, from a permission, and from an interpretation. It differs from a privilege, which is a permanent concession of favor. It differs from a permission, by which one is not freed from the observance of a law but actually observes the law in so far as he obtains the legally required consent of authority to do something, as when a religious obtains permission from his superior to go on a journey. And it differs from an interpretation, which declares that the law does not oblige in a certain instance, since in that case there is no exemption from an obligation but merely a declaration that none existed from the beginning. A dispensation is always granted by an act of the will of a competent superior, since only in this manner can the obligation be lifted. This act of the will need not necessarily be expressed by outward signs. Because of the necessity of this act, a dispensation, unlike a permission, cannot be presumed, for example, by presupposing that if the superior knew of this, he would grant a dispensation. The author of a dispensation must have jurisdiction, since the obligation imposed by law is removed. Therefore, a superioress cannot grant a dispensation, but she may grant a permission or even declare that the law does not oblige in certain instances, and such an interpretation in a favorable sense may also be given by one who is not a superior. For example, a doctor may declare a sick person incapable of fasting. The following individuals can grant a dispensation: the lawgiver, his successor, his superior, or anyone whom any of these three may delegate. They may dispense not only their own subjects but anyone within their jurisdiction. If the dispensation concerns a recurring obligation such as fasting or abstinence, the dispensation continues even after the strangers have again left the territory. Whoever has general faculties to dispense may also dispense himself, except when the power to dispense is to be exercised only in the sacrament of penance. A sufficient reason is required for the lawgiver, his successor, or superior to dispense lawfully. Others require such a reason to dispense validly. The reason must be in proportion to the gravity of the law. It need not be so great, however, as would be required to excuse one from the observance of the law. In a doubt as to whether one reason is sufficient or not, he may ask for a dispensation and his superior may validly and lawfully grant it. If one doubts whether a dispensation is necessary at all, it is recommended that he consult his superior, although there is generally no obligation to do so, unless there is question of the validity of a sacrament. For example, marriage, when in doubt about the existence of an impediment. If the dispensation is very necessary for the subject, the superior is obliged in charity to grant it, Should the dispensation not be granted in such instances, the subject may not act contrary to the law unless already excused by moral impossibility. The interpretation of a dispensation must generally be made so that its wording is understood in the strict sense. An exception to this rule obtains if the dispensation is given motu proprio, or in the interest of the common good, or if the dispensation is already contained in the legal enactments. Faculties to grant dispensations are to be broadly interpreted if they are general faculties, since they are a favor granted to him who dispenses thus. If a confessor is given faculties to dispense in the internal forum, he may use his faculties also outside the sacrament of confession. The faculty to dispense in a particular case must be interpreted strictly. Together with the faculties to dispense are granted all other powers without which the faculties cannot be exercised. The cessation of a dispensation may take place by revocation on the part of the competent superior, by the death of him who granted the dispensation in the rare cases in which he has expressly so determined, by renunciation on the part of the one dispensed if accepted by the competent superior, by the complete cessation of the principal reason for the dispensation in the case of recurring obligations, or by leaving the territory if the dispensation is territorial and not personal. Thus, one dispensed from fasting by reason of illness must fast as soon as he recovers his health, although if one doubts whether or not the reason for his dispensation has ceased, he may continue to use the dispensation. Should the dispensation have an indivisible effect, it does not expire with the cessation of the principal cause for which it was granted. Therefore, if one has received a marriage dispensation ad legitimundam prolem, he may use the dispensation even if the child dies before the marriage, provided, however, that it is still living at the moment the dispensation is granted. Members of a diocese where a dispensation from the law of abstinence is granted on certain days may not use this diocesan dispensation in other dioceses where no such dispensation exists. Privileges will be treated in their proper place. Acheabrindams, cessation of laws. A law ceases in consequence of a new law, a legitimate custom, or through the cessation of its purpose. 76.1. A new law abrogates a former law, if it expressly states this, or if it is directly contrary to the old law, or if it regulates anew the entire subject matter of the old law. Canon 22. In case of doubt, the revocation of an earlier law may not be presumed, but as far as possible the later law must be harmonized with it. Canon 23. If the new law is only partially contrary to the old, then the old law is repealed only in part. A general law revokes special laws only when this is explicitly stated. Canon 22. The Code revokes all contrary legislation, whether general or particular, unless the opposite is explicitly mentioned concerning particular laws. All former penalties which were not incorporated in the Code, all the general disciplinary legislation of the Church, which is not contained either in the Code itself or in approved liturgical books. Canon 6. A new law also revokes existing legal customs, but a general law does not revoke a particular custom, unless it expressly says so. So too, a law revokes a centenary or immemorial custom only when this is explicitly stated. Canon 30. Abstracting from a few exceptions, the Code revokes all contrary customs, even though they be particular, century-old, or immemorial. Centenary or immemorial customs contrary to the law may be tolerated if the Code has not reprobated them, and the ordinaries believe they cannot prudently be abolished. Canon 5. 77.2. Custom revokes a law of the Church only if it is reasonable and has enjoyed 40 years of uninterrupted observance. If the law forbids contrary customs in the future, only a centenary or immemorial custom can revoke the law. Canon 27. A custom expressly reprobated by law is unreasonable. Canon 27. A new custom may also revoke an existing legal custom. Canon 30. 78.3. The purpose of a law may cease for all people or only for individual persons. Likewise, a law observance may become useless or even harmful. 1. A law ceases automatically if it becomes universally useless. Such a law loses an essential characteristic. It no longer serves the common good. Compare 43.2. If a law becomes harmful for an individual, it ceases to oblige him if its observance becomes morally impossible, or if the said person may use a paikia. Concerning moral impossibility and its restrictions, see 69. Concerning a paikia, see 56.3. If a law becomes useless for an individual, he is still obliged to observe it according to the much more common opinion. The common welfare would otherwise suffer because many would imagine the law to be useless for them. If, however, in an individual case the law is manifestly useless, and non-compliance gives no scandal, one may follow the milder opinion and claim exemption. But even this latter exception would not apply in the case of legislation passed to avert a common danger. Canon 21. As for example, the church laws on the prohibition of books. 79. Chapter 6. Privileges. 1. Concept. A privilege is a right granting to individuals or individual classes of persons a favor not due to them by law. A privilege is like a law in this, that it is a permanent norm and it obliges others not to hinder the privileged person in the use of his special right. It differs from a law in that it may also be granted to a private person, whereas a law can only be passed for a community. A privilege differs from a dispensation by reason of its permanent character, dispensations usually being granted for special cases. A dispensation is, furthermore, always against the law, while a privilege may be beside the law. See 80. In a privilege against the law, the privileged person is no longer a subject of the law, whereas one dispensed remains subject to the law, but is only freed from its observance. 82. Division. Privileges may be a beside or against the law. Praeter vel contra eius. The latter derogates from the law, not the former. For example, a privilege against the law is freedom from choir duty. A privilege beside the law is the faculty to dispense. Habitual faculties granted perpetually, or for a definite period of time, or for a certain number of cases, are considered privileges beside the law. Canon 66. A. Personal or real, according as the immediate subject is a person or a thing. Thing here may mean a church, convent, diocese, state, or dignity, etc. C. Favorable or odious. Favorable privileges are a burden to no one, for example the faculty to absolve from reserved cases. An odious privilege, although it benefits individuals, curtails the rights of others or places a burden upon them, for example the privilege of a private oratory through which public services are prejudiced. 81. 3. Interpretation of privileges. Odious privileges must be interpreted strictly favorable ones, broadly. Even privileges that infringe upon the rights of others must be so interpreted that the privileged person will actually be deemed to be receiving a favor. Canon 68. 82. 4. Privileges are acquired by direct grant, communication, legitimate custom, or by prescription. 83. 5. Use of privileges. 1. In itself there is no obligation to use a privilege which has been granted one for his personal advantage. For special reasons, however, one may be obliged to use his privilege. Canon 69. Therefore, one who has the privilege of a private oratory need not use his privilege, and according to some authors, even if he could not otherwise hear Mass on Sunday. Reasons that make the use of a privilege obligatory are a command on the part of a competent superior, avoidance of scandal, charity, and justice. Thus a confessor, having begun to hear a confession, is obliged to use his privilege to absolve from reserved cases by virtue of an implicit contract. 2. The use of a privilege is obligatory if it is granted in the interest of the common welfare, since one may not injure the common good. Therefore, clerics must prudently use the privileges of their state. Compare 409 and following, and religious, their privilege of exemption. 84. 6. Cessation of privileges. A privilege ceases by 1. Revocation on the part of a competent superior. Canon 71. 60. Revocation may take place by a law. A general law to the contrary revokes privileges granted by the code. Other privileges are not revoked by law, unless the law expressly states otherwise, or unless the law is passed by the superior of the grantor of the privilege. B. A special act of revocation on the part of a competent superior. In this case the privilege remains until the revocation is made known to the grantee. 2. The death of the grantor or his loss of office terminates privileges granted with the clause ad beneplacitum nostrum, or an equivalent phrase. Canon 73. An equivalent clause would be durante meo munere, but not the expression de nec revocadero. 3. Renunciation of the grantee which is accepted by the competent superior. Canon 72. Privileges granted for one personal advantage may be renounced by private individuals, others may not. Non-use or contrary use of a privilege does not contain a renunciation. In such manner those privileges only are lost that are prejudicial to others, provided there is either a legitimate prescription against them or the non-use is equivalent to a tacit renunciation. Canon 76. A privilege is not automatically lost by abuse, but a person misusing his privilege should be deprived of it. Canon 78. 4. The death of the privileged person. Canon 74. Or the complete destruction of the thing or place with which the privilege is connected. Canon 75. A moral person becomes extinct when a competent superior suppresses it, or if it has ceased to exist for 100 years. Canon 102. Local privileges revive if the place destroyed is rebuilt within 50 years. Canon 75. A change of circumstances, namely if, according to the judgment of the superior, the privilege becomes harmful or its use unlawful. Canon 77. 6. The expiration of the period of time or the exhaustion of the number of cases for which it is granted. Canon 77. If no definite period of time is indicated, a privilege is presumed to be perpetual. Canon 70. Even after the time has elapsed or the number of cases has been exhausted, acts of jurisdiction of the internal forum exercised through inadvertence are valid. Canon 77. 207. 85. Part 3. Conscience. Chapter 1. Concept and division. 1. Concept. Conscience in the proper sense of the term is a judgment of the practical reason on the moral goodness or sinfulness of an action. Conscience becomes the proximate norm of moral conduct by applying the law to a concrete case. 2. Division. One antecedent and consequent conscience are so called according as the judgment is passed before an action is performed or only thereafter. In the antecedent conscience there is present the realization of obligation and imputability in relation to the norm of morality. The consequent conscience is accompanied by the sentiment of tranquility or remorse. 2. Right or erroneous is one conscience according as the verdict of reason agrees or disagrees with objective truth. An erroneous conscience is either culpable or inculpable, vincible or invincible. 3. Certain, doubtful, probable and perplexed conscience. A certain conscience passes judgment without fear of error. For moral certainty it suffices that all reasonable fear be excluded. In reality, however, an absolutely certain conscience can still be erroneous. The doubtful conscience suspends its judgment. The doubt may either concern a fact dubium facti or the lawfulness of an act and the existence of the law dubium iuris. A speculative doubt concerns the nature of an action and its moral character in general. A practical doubt concerns the lawfulness of an individual action about to be performed. Practical certainty is compatible with speculative doubt. The probable conscience passes judgment for weighty reasons, but with a reasonable fear of erring. Relative to the degree of probability, we distinguish probable, more probable, and most probable opinions. The perplexed conscience is one which, when confronted with two alternative precepts, fears sin in complying with either of them. 86. 4. Tender, lax, and scrupulous conscience. This distinction concerns principally a permanent disposition of conscience. The tender conscience forms an objectively correct judgment with comparative facility even in finer distinctions between good and evil. The lax conscience, on insufficient grounds, judges a thing to be lawful which is sinful or something to be a venial sin which is actually a mortal sin. The scrupulous conscience, prompted by purely imaginary reasons, is in constant dread of sin where there is none, or of mortal sin where there is only venial sin. The basic factor in a scrupulous conscience is not so much error as fear. The anxieties are not really rational in character, hence they do not really enter into the judgment of conscience. There is question here rather of representations of the fantasy, of sentient judgment, of impulses and movements of the sensitive appetite or emotions. The following are symptoms of a scrupulous conscience. Examination of conscience over petty, often ridiculous matters, restless rumination, scrutinizing all possible circumstances that accompanied an action or could have done so, frequent change of judgment. Indecision, fear of possible sin in all things. Consultation of different confessors, the fear of not being properly understood by them, clinging to one's own opinion in the face of their decisions. Sometimes it is not easy to recognize the scrupulous conscience. Especially with regard to himself, a person should not trust his own judgment, but accept the verdict of his confessor. A person may sometimes be scrupulous in some things and lax in others. The causes of scrupulosity are disorders in health, congenital morbid conditions of the organism, abnormal irritability, anemia, manic depressive impulses or pressure on the brain, vivid fancy, predominance of sentiment over reason, precocious ingenuity, excessive introspection, lack of judgment, sometimes also secret pride that justifies itself against every reproach or endeavors to acquire certainty, to the exclusion of all doubt, even unreasonable doubt. Finally, a lack of confidence in divine mercy. Scrupulous people are often to blame for aggravating their condition by not consistently using the prescribed remedies. Remedies for scrupulosity are prayer and trust in God, unconditional trustful obedience to one's spiritual director, formation of general rules of moral conduct and faithful adherence to them, even at the risk of making an occasional mistake, avoiding idleness, removal of the causes of scrupulosity, especially the organic disturbances. 87. Chapter 2. The binding force of conscience. 1. A certain conscience must always be obeyed when it commands or forbids. This holds for both the right and the erroneous conscience. Therefore, if one lies to help a neighbor out of a difficulty, convinced that to do so is an act of charity, he actually does perform a laudable act of fraternal charity, and should he act contrary to his erroneous conscience, he would sin. Whoever thinks that today is a day of abstinence and eats meat, sins, although, as a matter of fact, it is not a day of abstinence. But he who acts contrary to a certain, though erroneous conscience does not incur the penalties that are ipso facto incurred by a transgression of the law. Thus, one who strikes a layman thinking him to be a priest, commits indeed a sacrilege but does not incur excommunication. That which is unavoidable cannot be sinful, even though one falsely believes it to be a grave sin. Thus, a prisoner who cannot attend Mass on Sunday does not sin even though he thinks he has sinned mortally. A certain conscience may always be followed when it permits something. Therefore, if one eats meat on Friday in the belief that it is Thursday, he does not sin. 88. 2. In a practical doubt about the lawfulness of an action, one may never act. For the difference between a practical and a speculative doubt, compare 85. A hunter, doubting whether that which he is aiming at be an animal or a man, is guilty of homicide if he kills, even though it turns out that he slew an animal. Evidently, one need not bother about unreasonable doubts. Thus, if in spite of using all prescribed precautions one kills another while driving an automobile, he has not sinned even though he often thought he might kill someone while driving. That which is said of a practical doubt applies also to the practically probable conscience. 89. 3. With a perplexed conscience one must do that which seems to him the lesser evil. If both alternatives seem equally sinful, he may do as he pleases. The reason is that impossibility precludes sin, compare 69. The supposition is, however, that the action will not brook delay without great harm, and that no means are at hand to form a right conscience. 90. 4. A lax conscience may generally not be followed without grave sin if one thereby transgresses a law that obliges gravely. The reason is that such a conscience must generally be considered as culpably erroneous. Such a person must pay more attention to doubts that occur to him than others need do, and he may not so readily disregard them as mere scruples. In exceptional cases, the laxist may be excused from grave sin, namely, if he is unaware of the state of his conscience and does not recognize, even in a general way, the malice of an action or his duty to make further investigation. 90. 5. One may act contrary to a scrupulous conscience without sinning, even if the action be undertaken with great fear of committing sin. The scrupulous conscience is nothing else but a state of fear. The principle laid down holds even if the scrupulous person at the moment of acting does not think of his fear as a mere scruple. It suffices that he be habitually aware that he may do anything which he does not know for certain to be a mortal sin. A scrupulous person may do anything he sees conscientious people do, even though it be against his conviction. He need not use more than average carefulness when acting. If he cannot apply the directions given him and cannot seek advice, he may do as he chooses, provided there is no question of doing what is evidently and certainly sinful. A scrupulous person, by reason of the great harm that he may do to himself, may be excused from many positive duties, for example fraternal correction or confessional integrity. If impure thoughts arise by his looking at innocent objects or persons, he may look attentively at such things and becomingly at such persons, and pay no attention to the resulting emotions. If the scruple concerns the fulfillment of a duty breviary, penance, vow, etc., he may presume that he has adequately fulfilled his obligation. If the scruple concerns the sufficiency of his contrition, he may decide in his own favor. He need not confess sins committed before his last confession, unless he can swear that he certainly sinned gravely, and that he certainly has not yet confessed the sin. Even in this latter instance there may be circumstances that will excuse him from an integral confession. The same holds for doubts about the validity of previous confessions. Scrupulous persons who mistake their feeling of anxiety for remorse of conscience should be informed that the cause of this anxiety is the nerves and not some sin of which they may be guilty. There is even a duty to act contrary to scruples, for one might otherwise sin by pride, self-will, and disobedience, or because one's health or one's business might thereby suffer. If the scrupulous person is of good will, he will not readily sin grievously in an individual case. Because of the disadvantages mentioned, the confessor should not permit more than one complete manifestation of the scruples or one general confession. Even this single manifestation of the state of his conscience must be forbidden if the scrupulous person had shortly before discussed matters with a different confessor, and will evidently not remain long with the present one. 92. Chapter 3. The formation of a practically certain conscience. One must try to form a practically certain conscience, since it is never lawful to act with a practical doubt about the lawfulness of an action. Compare 88. 1. A direct solution to doubts of conscience in matters of frequent occurrence and lesser importance can usually be obtained by reflection, by investigation, and by asking counsel. Such a solution is necessary as long as there is well-founded hope that the doubt can be solved in this wise, if a degree of care in keeping with the importance of the matter at hand is employed, provided one does not choose to do the more certain thing in every case. 93. 2. An indirect solution to doubts of conscience, that is, one made by having recourse to certain principles and moral systems, is necessary if certainty cannot be obtained by the direct method. In an indirect solution, the theoretical doubt about the lawfulness or necessity of an action remains, but certainty is obtained as to what one must or may do here and now. 1. If there is question of the necessary attainment of an end, one must choose what is more certain, if one cannot dispel the theoretical doubt. If eternal salvation is at stake, one must use those means that will certainly lead to that end. As long as certain means are available, one may not employ means that are only probably sufficient. In administering the sacraments, one must, out of the reverence due to the sacrament, and often out of justice and charity, decide in favor of the opinion that safeguards the validity of the sacrament. If one cannot have certainly valid matter for the administration of a sacrament, he may for the sake of a soul's salvation use doubtful matter. If there is question of the certain right of another or of an injury threatening him, we must follow that opinion according to which the other will certainly obtain justice or be protected from harm. Thus, a physician may not use remedies whose effectiveness is doubtful if certainly effective remedies are available. A hunter may not shoot when he reasonably doubts whether he will injure a man by doing so. 94. 2. If the lawfulness of an action is doubtful, one may follow any opinion that is well-founded, even if the contrary opinion is more probable. Indeed, an opinion is well-founded if it would induce a prudent person to give his assent even after he has considered the reasons to the contrary. The fear that the opposite may be true need not be excluded. The reasons for an opinion may be intrinsic or extrinsic, according as they rest on insight and understanding or are based on the authority of others. In this latter instance, it is presumed that these others have an insight into the intrinsic reasons. Only a good moralist can pass on intrinsic evidence, whereas a person of average education may judge the extrinsic reasons. An unlettered person should abide by the judgment of a prudent confessor or pastor. Priests may follow the opinions of recognized moralists, or even follow St. Alphonsus alone. In many cases, it is relatively easy to determine whether an opinion that bespeaks freedom from an obligation is well-founded or not by the application of reflex principles. Some of the most important of these principles are: in doubt, do what is generally done in dubio iudicandum est ex communiter condicentibus. In doubt, decide in favor of the validity of an action already done in dubio standum est pro valore actus. No one may be presumed wicked unless his wickedness has been proved nemo malus nisi probetur. In doubt, we must interpret favorable things broadly, unfavorable things strictly favoris sunt ampliandi, odiosa restringenda. It is lawful to follow such a well-founded opinion, no matter which law is in question. This holds, be the law human, divine, positive, or natural law. The doubt may be whether the law exists or has ceased to exist, for example, because of fulfillment, even if in other cases one has decided in favor of the contrary opinion. Therefore, one may in one instance accept an inheritance coming to him from an informal testament, and in another instance he may petition a judicial declaration of the invalidity of such a testament. In one and the same matter one may not, however, follow two contrary opinions, since by doing so one would certainly transgress the law. Thus, if one has accepted the inheritance, he must also recognize as valid, and therefore pay off the legacies contained in an informal testament. 95. Note: the various moral systems. Since the opinion we have just stated, 94, is not shared by all moralists, we shall merely mention the different moral systems. Absolute tutiorism teaches that in every difference of opinion one must choose what is certain, and thus decide in favor of compliance with the law, and that only full certainty of the opposite frees one from observance of the law. Mitigated tutiorism frees from an obligation if the opinion in favor of liberty is probable in the highest degree probabilissima. Probabiliorism maintains that only then may one follow the opinion that favors liberty, when the reasons for this opinion are certainly more probable than those which favor the law.
Equiprobabilism demands that the opinion favoring freedom be equally or almost equally probable as the opinion favoring the law. Furthermore, one may apply this principle only when the doubt concerns the existence of a law, not in a doubt as to whether an existing law has ceased to bind or has been fulfilled. Compensationism, or the principle of the sufficient reason, teaches that when one doubts the lawfulness of an action, he must have a sufficiently grave reason to decide in favor of the opinion that is contrary to the law. The graver the law, and the more probable the reasons favoring it, the greater also must be the reasons for exposing oneself to the danger of a material transgression. Probabilism is the system we adopted 94, and according to it, anyone may follow the opinion that favors liberty as long as he is certain that it is well-founded, even though the contrary opinion be more probable. Laxism permits one to follow the opinion that favors liberty, even though it be only slightly or doubtfully probable. In evaluating these various systems, we need only remember that the systems of absolute tutiorism and laxism have been condemned by the Church. All other systems are tenable. In practice, the confessor should endeavor to freely choose the more perfect thing himself, and should likewise advise his penitents to do the better thing. Let him not forget, however, that he has no right to impose his own opinion on his penitents as long as the contrary view is solidly probable.
Part 4. Sin. Chapter 1. Sin in general. 1. Concept. Sin is the voluntary transgression of the divine law. Sin may be committed either by doing something which the law prohibits, or by omitting something which the law commands. Such an offense is called a sin of commission when something forbidden is done, and a sin of omission when something commanded is neglected. One may offend God by an internal or an external act. In the latter case, the act may be spiritual or corporeal. This transgression of the divine law must be a free moral act, at least indirectly voluntary, that is, a voluntary cause of bad results. A material transgression of the divine law, that is, an act that would be a sin if it were voluntary, is not sinful because it is not willed. Fatalistic expressions like, "What can I do? I am a sinner," are somewhat blasphemous and should be eliminated from everyday speech. Only that which is at the same time forbidden by God and willed by a reasonable creature is a sin. 2. Division. Sins are divided in many ways because of the many distinctions in the moral sphere. But the following are the principal divisions. Sins of commission and omission. In acting, one may undertake what is sinful or omit what is commanded. Omission of something forbidden is no sin, but omission of something commanded is sinful. Internal and external sins. The act of the will that deliberately desires something sinful is a formal internal sin. The deliberate arousal of sinful thoughts or images in the imagination constitutes a virtual internal sin. All formal internal sins, even if they are not perfected by some act in the external forum, are properly sins. External sins may be spiritual, like heretical preaching or assisting at non-Catholic services, or they may be corporeal, in which case they are called sins of the body, sins of thought, word, or deed. A sin of thought is an internal formal sin, that is, a deliberate evil desire or consent to something sinful. A mere suggestion in the imagination is not sinful if it is not knowingly and willingly summoned. Even something good can be turned to sin by evil intention, for example, someone pretending to pray. Mortal and venial sins are distinguished by their gravity and punishment. Sins derive from the 7 capital vices: pride, covetousness, lust, anger, gluttony, envy, and sloth. Another important distinction is that between sins evil in themselves mala in se, and those evil only because forbidden mala quia prohibita. Sins against the natural law are evil in themselves, whereas some obligations may bind only lightly, even in important matters when the legislator did not intend grave guilt. 3. The malice of sin. The malice of sin arises from its opposition to God will. One mortal sin destroys sanctifying grace, severs friendship with God, and merits hell. Even venial sin offends God and impedes spiritual progress. One should fear sin above all things because it is the greatest of all evils. Sins against God are worse than sins against neighbor because they directly injure the divine majesty. The gravity of sin depends on the object, intention, and circumstances. Circumstances may increase the guilt or even change the species of sin. Sins against the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, are most grievous, and sins against charity directly oppose God as the final end. Sins of impurity, though not always the gravest objectively, are spiritually dangerous because they weaken reason and will. The so-called sins against the Holy Spirit, final impenitence, despair, presumption, resisting known truth, obstinacy in sin, and envy of spiritual good, are not unpardonable in themselves but make repentance unlikely. Certain sins are said to cry to heaven for vengeance: willful murder, the sin of Sodom, oppression of the poor, and defrauding laborers of their wages. The sin of scandal is particularly grave because it leads another into sin. Scandal may be given or taken. One is culpable if he foreseeably causes or encourages the fall of another. Necessary duties must not be omitted because of the scandal taken by the malicious. 4. Causes of sin. The internal causes of sin arise from the will and the disordered inclinations that accompany fallen human nature. The will, when freely choosing something contrary to God's law, is the true source of sin. Disordered passions, such as anger, lust, envy, and fear, may incline one to sin but do not make sin inevitable, for reason retains dominion unless one voluntarily relinquishes it. Ignorance, weakness, and malice are traditionally identified as underlying dispositions. Ignorance removes or diminishes guilt when it is involuntary, but when it is affected or culpably negligent, it may be the very cause of grave sin. Weakness or frailty inclines one to yield quickly to passion. Malice signifies deliberate choice of evil as such. External causes of sin include the world, the devil, bad company, and harmful occasions. The world entices by disordered customs, human respect, and attraction to honors, pleasures, and wealth. The devil tempts by suggestion, deception, or stimulation of imagination, though he cannot force the will. Persons may also be external causes of sin when they give scandal, induce another to sin, or provide occasions or assistance for wrongdoing. Some sins arise from habit, whereby repeated acts generate a proclivity that eventually inclines the will strongly. Habit diminishes voluntariness in some cases but increases it in others, depending on whether the habit was freely acquired and whether one strives earnestly against it. 5. Temptation. Temptation is a solicitation to sin, arising either from internal inclination, external suggestion, or diabolical influence. Temptation in itself is not sinful unless it is deliberately sought, fostered, or consented to. Mere thoughts or images that arise without consent are not sins. Sin begins only when the will gives deliberate approval to an evil suggestion. The process of temptation often occurs in stages. First, there is the suggestion, which is morally indifferent when not willfully entertained. Second, there is delectation or pleasure in the thought. If this pleasure is involuntary, it is not sinful, but if knowingly fostered, it becomes venially sinful. Third, there is consent, the formal element of sin, which makes the act internal, and if the matter is grave, mortal. Temptations may be permitted by God for one's spiritual growth, giving opportunity for merit and purification. One is obliged to resist temptations that are dangerous. Resistance may be direct, by rejecting the thought, or indirect, by turning attention to something else. Sensual or violent temptations should be resisted indirectly by distraction. Temptations against faith or hope should be resisted directly by acts of faith, hope, and humility. Temptations cannot be entirely avoided, but one must avoid unnecessary exposure to them. Seeking temptations without justification is sinful. Despair over temptation or over the difficulty of resisting is itself a spiritual danger, for God grants sufficient grace for each trial. 6. Occasions of sin. An occasion of sin is any external circumstance in which a person is prone to fall. Occasions may be proximate or remote. A proximate occasion is one in which a person, either by the nature of the circumstance or by his own weakness, ordinarily sins. A remote occasion is one in which the danger is slight or infrequent. Occasions may be voluntary or necessary. A voluntary occasion is one that a person can reasonably avoid. A necessary occasion is one that a person can reasonably avoid. A necessary occasion is one that cannot be avoided without serious inconvenience or harm, as may occur with duties of state or the obligations of life. One is obliged to avoid all voluntary proximate occasions of mortal sin, for to remain in them without necessity is itself mortally sinful. Even remote occasions should be avoided when possible. Necessary occasions of sin may be tolerated when there is proportionate reason, but one must employ special diligence, prayer, and prudence. Confessors may refuse absolution to penitents who refuse to avoid voluntary proximate occasions of grave sin. When the occasion concerns another person's sin rather than one's own, one must consider whether cooperation or scandal is involved. Friendship, employment, or family relationships may sometimes make an occasion necessary, but even then one must adopt safeguards. The refusal to withdraw from a voluntary proximate occasion, especially in sins of impurity, drunkenness, or theft, manifests lack of firm purpose of amendment. Seven. Cooperation in the sin of another. Cooperation may be formal or material. Formal cooperation occurs when one shares another evil intention or wills the sinful act. This is always sinful and generally mortal when the matter is grave. Material cooperation occurs when one contributes in some way to another's sinful act without sharing the evil intention. Material cooperation may be immediate or mediate, proximate or remote. Immediate material cooperation, in which one performs a part essential to the sinful act, is ordinarily sinful because it renders the cooperator morally responsible for the evil. Mediate cooperation, in which one provides something that is not essential to the sin, may be lawful when there is a proportionately grave reason and when scandal is avoided. Cooperation with another sin is unlawful when the act directly enables or encourages the sin, when the cooperator's action is unnecessary, or when his involvement implies approval. Cooperation is lawful when the action is good or indifferent in itself, when the cooperator does not share the evil intention, when refusal would cause serious harm or injustice, and when the cooperator's involvement is sufficiently remote. Public officials, physicians, merchants, employers, and others often face situations of material cooperation. Moral judgment in such cases requires prudence. One may never cooperate formally with sin. Material cooperation must be justified by proportionate reason. The danger of scandal must always be considered. Scandal arises when one action leads or appears to lead another into sin. At times, to avoid scandal, an act which would otherwise be morally permissible must be omitted. In other cases, necessary actions must not be abandoned due to the malicious scandal of others. 8. Mortal and venial sin. A mortal sin is a grievous transgression of the law of God that results in the loss of sanctifying grace and separates the soul from God. 3 conditions are required for a sin to be mortal: grave matter, full knowledge, and full consent of the will. Grave matter is determined by the object of the act according to the divine law and the teaching of the Church. Full knowledge means that the person understands that the act is seriously sinful at the time he commits it. Full consent means a deliberate intention and free choice of the will. If any of these conditions is absent, the sin is not mortal. A venial sin is a lesser offense against God's law that does not deprive the soul of sanctifying grace, though it weakens charity and makes the soul more inclined to mortal sin. Venial sin may occur when the matter is light, when full advertence is lacking, or when full consent is absent. Deliberate venial sin, though not deadly, is nevertheless an offense against God and should be carefully avoided. Venial sin may be forgiven by prayer, works of charity, acts of contrition, and reception of Holy Communion, but mortal sin requires sacramental confession when possible. The difference between mortal and venial sin is not determined by intensity of passion. Grave passion may accompany venial sin, and mortal sin may be committed without passion at all. What determines the species is the objective gravity of the act and the degree of knowledge and consent. 9. Conditions that diminish or increase the gravity of sin. The gravity of sin may be lessened by ignorance, inadvertence, fear, force, passion, weakness, habit, or mental disturbance, provided that these reduce voluntariness. Ignorance diminishes guilt when it is not willed or when it is only vincible to a small degree. Fear may diminish guilt, especially when the threatened evil is grave and the resistance of the will weakened. Force that destroys freedom removes all imputability. Force that merely makes resistance difficult diminishes guilt. Antecedent passion lessens voluntariness, but does not excuse entirely unless the reason is so disturbed that consent is nearly impossible. Weakness or frailty does not excuse sin but lessens culpability when it is involuntary. Habit may sometimes diminish guilt when an act is done without deliberation, but it increases guilt if the habit was freely acquired and is not earnestly resisted. Mental disturbances such as severe melancholia, compulsive disorders, or psychopathic defects may greatly reduce culpability when they seriously impede deliberation or free choice. Conversely, guilt is increased when there is malice, mature deliberation, contempt of law, frequency of sin, scandal, or when the sin is committed out of hatred of God or the Church. Sins committed with full reflection, without passion, and with firm purpose are more grievous. 10. Circumstances that change the species of sin. Circumstances may merely aggravate or diminish guilt, but they may also change the moral species of an act. A circumstance changes the species when it alters the object of the act in a morally essential way. Thus, theft becomes sacrilege when sacred things are stolen. Striking a parent becomes the sin of violating the fourth commandment. Sins of impurity become incest when committed with a close relative. Likewise, homicide differs according to the person slain. Murder of a priest, for instance, contains the malice of sacrilege. Some circumstances are integral to the moral species: time, place, person, manner, end, and consequences. Circumstances may increase guilt when they show greater contempt, greater harm, or greater depravity. They may diminish guilt when they show less freedom, less deliberation, or less malice. Confessors must ascertain circumstances that change the species of sin, but should avoid unnecessary inquiry into circumstances irrelevant to the moral nature of the act. Table is the and sex the puppet of figure as haft are in the squills. A merchant commits tempt for divine law when the sinner grows hardened, or when sin becomes habitual. Repeated venial sins dispose toward mortal sin by weakening the will and darkening the intellect. Repeated mortal sin increases the danger of final impenitence and may lead to a hardened heart. Yet repetition may also diminish guilt when sins occur through inveterate habit against the will and when sincere efforts to correct the habit are made. God offers grace even to the hardened sinner, but resistance to grace becomes more entrenched with each deliberate sin. Persistence in sin is especially dangerous in sins of impurity, drunkenness, and malice, which quickly undermine self-control. The confessor must encourage perseverance and hope, but also warn against the danger of presumption. 12. Habit and its effect on imputability. Habit is an acquired inclination that disposes a person to act with ease. Habits may be good or bad. A habit lessens responsibility when the act is done without advertence, and when sincere, serious efforts are being made to eradicate the habit. In such cases, the act may not be fully voluntary and thus not fully sinful. But habit increases guilt when the habit was freely contracted, when one neglects reasonable means for its removal, or when the habit becomes an excuse for sloth and tepidity. A person with a bad habit is obliged to fight the habit with means suited to the matter, such as prayer, sacraments, counsel, avoidance of occasions, mortification, and replacement of the bad habit with a contrary good habit. The sin lies not only in the habitual act itself, but especially in the neglect to resist and overcome the habit. A person who makes no effort at all to combat a dangerous habit commits grave sin by that omission, even if the individual acts prompted by the habit are performed with diminished advertence.
13. Imputability in special psychological states. There are circumstances in which mental or emotional disturbance may greatly diminish or even remove responsibility. When the reason is so impeded that deliberation becomes nearly impossible, the act may not be fully voluntary. Strong fear, violent passion, certain forms of mental illness, compulsive impulses, or severe melancholia may obstruct free decision. A person suffering from grave emotional depression, obsessive fears, or paralyzing anxiety may act with greatly diminished freedom. Compulsive ideas and impulses often arise independently of the will and without its consent. These are not sins unless deliberately fostered. Even when such impulses result in actions, the guilt may be only venial or even non-existent, if the person could hardly have acted otherwise. Delusion, hallucination, or serious disturbance of imagination may impede reason. When a person is overwhelmed by terror or by sudden panic, he may act blindly with little or no deliberation. Concupiscence or passion arising suddenly and antecedently may reduce voluntariness. Yet one must distinguish between what arises involuntarily and what is deliberately sustained. A person is obliged to resist sinful impulses to the extent he is able. Failure to resist when possible increases guilt, but inability to resist excuses. In many cases, only God can judge accurately the extent to which freedom was impaired.
13. Scruples and their effect on moral responsibility.
A scrupulous conscience is one that fears sin where there is none, or mortal sin where there is only venial sin. Scruples often arise not from reason but from emotional or imaginative factors, such as anxiety, nervous exhaustion, inherited weakness, melancholia, compulsive tendencies, or excessive introspection. Scruples may lead a person to imagine sin in ordinary actions or to mistake natural feelings for consent. A scrupulous person may be tempted to confess repeatedly the same doubtful matters, or to analyze excessively minor circumstances. This condition does not increase guilt, but may diminish responsibility when the person acts under emotional distress or fear. The spiritual director must guide the scrupulous person with firmness and gentleness, forbidding unnecessary repetition in confession and encouraging trust in God's mercy. The scrupulous penitent may be excused from many positive obligations when fulfilling them would cause serious psychological distress, provided that the duties omitted are not essential under pain of grave sin. A scrupulous person may licitly act contrary to his fears when he knows, at least habitually, that these fears have no foundation. Fidelity to the confessor guidance is essential. Over time, regular confession, simplification of examination of conscience, avoidance of idleness, and the cultivation of trust in God may alleviate the condition. 15. Imputability in melancholia, psychosis, and compulsive disorders. Severe melancholia may render a person incapable of joy, overwhelmed by sadness, or paralyzed by fear. Such individuals may suffer delusions, self-accusations, despair, or suicidal impulses. When their emotional state is so oppressive that contrary considerations cannot arise or cannot be sustained in consciousness, they often lack sufficient freedom for grave sin. Their actions may proceed from distorted perceptions that override normal reflection. Similarly, persons suffering from psychopathic inferiority, severe anxiety disorders, or compulsive neuroses may have difficulty forming firm decisions or resisting impulses. Their memory, judgment, and emotional balance may be impaired. While they retain responsibility for actions taken with deliberation, they are often less culpable when their condition substantially impedes freedom. The confessor must show great patience, avoiding unnecessary probing and offering clear, simple counsel. He must distinguish between truly irresistible impulses and those that can be resisted with reasonable effort. In cases of doubt regarding culpability, charity requires giving the penitent the benefit of the doubt. 16. Suicidal impulses and moral responsibility. Suicidal thoughts may arise in severe depression, psychosis, or overwhelming emotional distress. When the will is impaired by intense fear, despair, or delusion, responsibility may be greatly diminished. Suicide itself is a grave sin in fully responsible individuals, but those who act under severe mental disturbance may not be fully culpable. These individuals often require medical treatment more than moral admonition. Their confessor should urge them to seek appropriate help, encourage hope, and remind them of God's mercy. Repeated warnings, patient listening, and spiritual encouragement are essential. A confessor must never suggest that suicide is permissible, but he may reassure the family of those who die under such conditions that the person may not have been fully responsible. 17. Final considerations regarding imputability. Because so many factors influence the will, ignorance, passion, fear, mental condition, habit, determining the precise degree of guilt in a given case can be extremely difficult. Often only God knows the extent to which a person was free. The confessor must therefore proceed with prudence, avoiding harsh judgment while still upholding the moral law. He should not insist on strict obligations when a penitent clearly lacks the psychological strength to fulfill them without serious harm. He must also warn penitents not to use psychological excuses to avoid genuine responsibilities. Charity and justice require that he neither relax the law unnecessarily nor impose burdens greater than the penitent can bear. The aim is always the salvation of souls, the restoration of grace, and the encouragement of virtue. 18. Conclusion of the doctrine on sin. Sin is a voluntary offense against God's law. Its gravity depends on the nature of the act, the knowledge and consent of the will, and the surrounding circumstances. The spiritual life requires vigilance against occasions of sin, resistance to temptation, and the cultivation of habits of virtue. Mortal sin destroys friendship with God and requires sacramental confession. Venial sin weakens the soul and should be diligently avoided. Growth in holiness requires not only avoiding sin, but also practicing virtue, receiving the sacraments, and cultivating prayer, charity, and self-denial. In the weaknesses and complexities of human life, God's grace is always sufficient. Even those who fall often may rise again through repentance. The Church, through her pastors, offers counsel, absolution, encouragement, and necessary discipline. The goal of all moral effort is union with God, and the struggle against sin is an essential part of that ascent.